Gray wolves are among the most widespread mammals on Earth, with many distinct regional subspecies, each shaped by the terrain and climate that they live in. But they once had a far wider range, and some of these regional forms that managed to survive into modern times have had the unfortunate fate of disappearing only within the last century and a half. In this video, we're going to look at 12 subspecies of gray wolf that no longer exist today, and hear about the little that we know about them and the places that they lived. The Japanese archipelago was once home to two subspecies of gray wolf, one of which was simply known as the Japanese wolf. It was the smaller of the pair and lived mostly in the rugged interior mountains of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. Because of the rugged landscape that it inhabited, the wolves of Japan became shaped to survive in dense forest and steep terrain, rather than open tundra and plains like many other wolves. As a result, this subspecies was compact, with shorter legs and a fox-like skull shape. Rural communities often referred to these wolves as okami, and they were seen as mountain guardians, with small roadside or forest shrines marking that cultural presence long before modern surveys were taking place. The Japanese wolf's decline was fast and relatively recent. Rabies arrived in the late 19th century and tore through canid populations on the islands. Logging and new road networks opened up untouched forest to settlers. Wolves that had once been tolerated or even respected were suddenly treated as pests and hunted or poisoned as ranching spread. In 1905, a specimen from Nara became the last widely accepted physical record of the subspecies. There are still occasional claims and rare survey reports suggesting that a remnant population persists somewhere in the more secluded parts of Honshu, but nothing verifiable has surfaced. However, these rumors have kept the Japanese wolf in the public imagination, and some think that it's still out there. The other subspecies of gray wolf that was found in Japan is the Hokkaido wolf. Unlike the small mountain wolves of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, this was a much larger northern form, adapted to the colder, snowier climate of Hokkaido and other nearby Russian islands, including Sakhalin, Iturup, and Kunashir. It was likely behaviorally closer to the mainland gray wolves of Siberia than to the Japanese subspecies to the south. The Hokkaido wolf was not a forest microspecialist, but a broader northern predator, and it had a reputation in some regions for killing horses and other introduced livestock. Because of this, its relationship with humans was more openly hostile, especially after large-scale colonization of Hokkaido accelerated in the late 19th century, following Japan's political consolidation of the north. The Hokkaido wolf's extermination was fast and intentional. Large numbers of horses were being raised on the island, and the government imported strychnine from the United States specifically to poison the wolves. Ranching companies worked directly with local officials to spread the poison in bait, and within a few years, the subspecies collapsed. The last accepted Hokkaido wolf died in 1889. Unlike the Japanese wolf, which continues to inspire rumors of survival, the Hokkaido wolf has no real modern fringe of hope attached to it. It disappeared so fast, and with so many government and corporate records of direct poisoning, that there's very little space left for doubt. This subspecies is gone. Moving across the Pacific, the Cascade Mountain Range, which extends from southern British Columbia, Canada, down through Washington, Oregon, and northern California, was home to a subspecies of gray wolf known as the Cascade Mountain Wolf. It occupied this long chain of temperate mountains and valleys, where it regularly interacted with the indigenous people who lived there for millennia. But before it could be well documented, it disappeared. By the time naturalists visited the region in the 20th century, the wolf was already in steep decline, and scientists only managed to collect a very limited amount of material. From the various accounts, we know that this western wolf subspecies had a distinct cinnamon to buff coat, setting it apart from neighboring subspecies. European settlers who moved into the region in the late 1800s left records of widespread persecution, and the Cascades became another place where bounties, poison campaigns, and habitat change converged. The Cascade Mountain Wolf didn't survive long enough for later generations to record it properly, and by the time wolf conservation emerged in the modern era, it was already gone from the United States. There is still a tiny possibility that a small population survives in some parts of coastal British Columbia, but it isn't recognized or protected by the Canadian government, and hybridization with other local subspecies likely means that no pure animals survive today. The highlands of Arizona and New Mexico also once had their own subspecies of gray wolf, the Mogollon Mountain Wolf. It lived in the rugged interior, where pine-covered plateaus, volcanic mesas, and deep canyons dominate the landscape. Some descriptions suggest that it tended toward a paler or buff-gray coat compared to other subspecies. And like other subspecies, its disappearance is tied closely to the expansion of cattle ranching, especially in the early 20th century, when government-backed predator control campaigns intensified. In the American Southwest, wolves were seen less as part of the landscape and more as obstacles to livestock, and the Mogollon Mountain Wolf was one of the casualties of that mindset. It was later merged with another subspecies, the Mexican wolf, which is still extant. The Mogollon Mountain Wolves that were once native to Arizona and New Mexico eventually disappeared. The last one seen in New Mexico was in 1927, and the final wolf was shot in Arizona in 1960. However, beginning in the 1990s, Mexican wolves have been reintroduced to both states, with a total population of fewer than 300 between the two states today. The southern Rocky Mountain Wolf was once found living in the central and southern Rockies, including Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, northern Arizona, and northwestern New Mexico, and it probably ranged into parts of Idaho and Nevada as well. Historical notes describe a wolf that tended toward a gray or buff-toned coat that was larger than some nearby subspecies and had more blackish-buff hairs on its back. Though as with many Western forms, the details are scarce, because this subspecies vanished early in the era of official wildlife record-keeping. What we do know is that its decline was tied to the rapid rise of livestock ranching across the interior West. Bounty systems, government poison programs, and private predator control all targeted wolves through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the southern Rocky Mountain Wolf was one of the first to disappear. It was recognized as a subspecies in 1937, but within only a few years, it was already effectively gone from almost all of its range. By the time wildlife agencies began to rethink wolf policies in the latter part of the 20th century, this subspecies was nowhere to be found. In Texas, the Texas gray wolf lived in southern and western parts of the state, crossing occasionally into northeastern Mexico. These wolves lived in mesquite plains, thorn scrub, and hotter, drier country than most other North American wolves. Compared to their neighbors to the north, they were generally darker and more wiry in build, with accounts describing a narrower head and more arched forehead. They fell victim to the same aggressive ranching expansion as other subspecies, and the last known Texas gray wolf was killed in 1942. By the time the Mexican wolf reintroductions began decades later, this subspecies was already long gone, remembered only through a few specimens, descriptions, and a handful of rare photographs. When William Bartram visited Florida in the 1770s, he encountered a strange wolf that lived in the peninsula's pine flatwoods, scrub, and cypress swamps. Rather than the usual gray or buff, it was black, so he referred to it as the black wolf, or Canis niger, in his notes. Other accounts also describe a small, slim animal that was among the smallest wolf subspecies and slimmer than wolves further to the north. Its generally dark color led to its common name, the Florida black wolf. The taxonomy of this subspecies is not fully settled, with many modern taxonomists disagreeing on where it fits within North America's wolves. Most now treat this animal as part of the red wolf complex, but some still consider it a gray wolf subspecies. Either way, its darker coat likely helped it blend into deer-rich hammocks and thick scrub. 19th century settlers left a paper trail of trapping and shooting, and by the early 20th century, it had vanished from the state. Moving from the subtropical pine flats of Florida to the high latitudes of Alaska brings us to one of the largest known subspecies of gray wolf, the Kenai Peninsula Wolf. This was a big-bodied northern form found on the Kenai Peninsula south of Anchorage, and it was a distinctly large and heavy subspecies. It was described based on 5 skulls from the region, which were larger than typical wolf skulls, but much of its morphology has been hard to determine. Accounts describe animals as having unusually robust limbs, sometimes noted for being among the largest wolves ever recorded, and fur that was typically silver gray and brindle black in color. Unlike the smaller, wiry wolves of the American South, this was a wolf adapted to cold forests, deep snow, and to preying on the massive ungulates of Alaska's coastal interior, specifically moose. In fact, this subspecies was so closely tied to hunting moose that its subspecies name literally references the scientific name of moose. Hunting pressure increased rapidly in the early 20th century as the peninsula was settled and speculative big game tourism grew. The Kenai Peninsula wolf was wiped out through poisoning and hunting, and the last of this subspecies disappeared sometime in the 1920s. Today, wolves in the Kenai region are descended from other Alaskan forms that recolonized after the Kenai Peninsula wolf was already gone. Bernard's wolf was an Arctic island subspecies that lived on Banks Island and Victoria Island in Canada's far north. It's known from very few physical specimens and only a handful of written notes from early 20th century expeditions that moved through the area. The observations describe a wolf that was pale, usually white or off-white, which isn't surprising given the vast tundra, long winter snow cover, and the seasonal sea ice that connected those islands to the western mainland. Its scientific name comes from Peter Bernard, a Hudson's Bay Company employee whose records helped form the basis of the original description. This subspecies never had much interaction with people simply because almost nobody lived in that part of the Arctic, and very few collectors or fur hunters ever traveled to Banks or Victoria Island. How the subspecies disappeared isn't known. The population may have been extremely small and fragile, and perhaps a series of rough winters was all it took to wipe them out. It's believed to have disappeared at some point in the early or mid-20th century, leaving only a few skins and skulls in museums as evidence that this isolated island subspecies once existed. The Manitoba wolf was a pale northern subspecies that lived in central Canada, from northern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, east into northwestern Ontario, and north into southern parts of the Northwest Territories. Historically, specimens and written descriptions suggest that it tended toward a light gray or gray-white coat, and some early naturalists described them as being very washed out, almost making the wolves seem ghost-like. The name griseoalbus literally refers to the gray-white color that set it apart from many of the darker boreal wolves that live farther west. Like several other prairie and subarctic wolves, it was not well documented. It was described in the 19th century when Western Canada was still being opened by rail and fur trade surveys, and by the time more systematic wildlife collecting began, these wolves were already in rapid decline. Some modern authors treat the Manitoba wolf as its own subspecies. Others merge it with the Hudson Bay wolf or with neighboring boreal forms. Either way, wolves with this ghost-pale color pattern were common enough to be noticed and given a name. Most sources agree that this subspecies disappeared during the first half of the 20th century as ranching spread west. The Manitoba wolf faded away during that period and is now considered extinct. The wolves that live in central Canada today are descended from other surviving boreal populations that recolonized these areas later on. In Canada's east, the island of Newfoundland was once home to its own subspecies of grey wolf, the Newfoundland wolf. This subspecies was also pale, often described as having a particularly light coat compared to most mainland eastern wolves, which isn't surprising given the snowy boreal forests and windy barrens that defined much of the island. There were also fully white and melanistic forms that were known to be present on the island. Older accounts treated it as a grey wolf subspecies, and this is generally how it has been remembered, although some modern genetic interpretations suggest that it may have been more closely related to the eastern red wolf complex instead. Regardless, it was a subspecies that evolved in isolation on this island in the North Atlantic, surviving until people arrived in larger numbers during the 19th century. People began to relentlessly trap, poison, and shoot the wolves until there weren't any left. As far as we know, the last Newfoundland wolf was killed in 1911, and the few times wolves have been seen in Newfoundland over the last century can most likely be attributed to Labrador wolves that successfully swam across the Gulf of St. Lawrence to recolonize the island. The last extinct subspecies of grey wolf that we're going to take a look at was found in Europe, on an island in the Mediterranean. The Sicilian wolf was an island population of grey wolf. It lived only on Sicily, where its isolation shaped a smaller, paler wolf than the mainland Italian form. Museum specimens and historical descriptions describe light sandy to straw-colored coats and a generally slighter build and shorter legs, likely reflecting the island's more arid landscape. In recent years, DNA extracted from preserved Sicilian wolf samples confirmed that while related to wolves on the Italian mainland, it was genetically distinct, validating its status as its own subspecies. The wolf survived well into modern times, with the last confirmed physical specimen dating to 1883, though an animal killed in 1924 near Bellolampo is also widely considered to be the last known surviving animal. Other scattered accounts and reports suggest that remnant animals persisted even later, with several coming from the 1930s and a few even as late as the 1960s and 70s. Hunting pressure was intense by the 19th century, and as agriculture expanded across the island, the local wolf population collapsed. When it was finally recognized formally as a distinct subspecies, it was already gone. Today, all we have are a few museum specimens, some artwork, and a single photograph to remind us of this unique wolf that once called Sicily home. And that's it for this week's video. Which of these subspecies was new to you? Let me know in the comments below. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to make a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.